Get started?
Okay, yes, everyone have a great meeting.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome everyone to today's virtual event, a discussion of trilateral collaborations between the library, writing center, and composition instructors. This event is sponsored by the ACRL Committee for Student Learning and Information Literacy. I'm going to take a few moments to introduce our speakers, and then they'll take it away with their presentation. After their presentation, we'll have time for some questions and answers. Please feel free to put them in the chat box. So our panelists today are Trina Napier, Dr. Jill Parrott, and Dr. Erin Presley. Trina Napier is an Associate University Librarian at Eastern Kentucky University, where she is the Associate Director of Programs and Outreach for the Knowles Studio for Academic Creativity, as well as the Program Director for the Minor in Applied Creative Thinking at Eastern Kentucky University. As Associate Director of Programs and Outreach, she collaborates with internal and external campus partners to create, implement, and promote spaces, services, and programs that engage, inspire, and support students in developing information literacy, research, writing, and communication skills. Our next panelist, Dr. Jill Parrott, is an Associate Professor in the Department of English at Eastern Kentucky University, where she is the coordinator of first-year writing and co-director of the Quality Enhancement Plan, Read with Purpose. Her research interests include the material nature of contemporary authorship and the integration of reading and writing for disciplinary information literacy. She currently provides interdisciplinary faculty professional development on the importance of critical reading for the development of independent learning strategies, and you can find her essay about the bad idea that some people are just born good writers on Inside Higher Ed. And our third panelist today, Dr. Erin Presley, is an Associate Professor of English at Eastern Kentucky University, where she serves as her home department's assessment coordinator and as the university's coordinator for general education and QEP assessment. Currently, her research focuses on Appalachian studies, including the impact of service learning projects in economically distressed areas in Eastern Kentucky and the complicated legacy of government-supported initiatives in the Mountain South, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Okay, and now our presentation.
Okay, hello. This is Erin Presley. We're so happy to be with you today. I'm going to get us started. I'm assuming that most of you have read our article, A Collaborative Trilateral Approach to Bridging the Information Literacy Gap in Student Writing. But in case you haven't, I'm going to be providing some background information on our research. So I'm going to start with where we started with this, which was in our first year writing program, specifically in English 102, way back in 2012. So just to give you a little bit of history, Jill and I had just agreed to serve as co-coordinators of the first year writing program around this time and inherited the 2012 general education assessment of the course. And we assess the sequence through the second part of it, the English 102 class. The assessment instrument is an 8-page research paper, so it's pretty traditional. And what we found from that assessment was that students were really struggling with the information literacy piece. And if you're asking students to write a research paper, that is a really important part of it. At this point in the history of the program, the courses were only required to complete one library instruction session and had no formal relationship with our writing center. So this was a very traditional bilateral approach that the program was using at this time. So we decided that we really needed to focus on supporting our students' use of information literacy. And now Trina's going to talk a little bit about this from the library side of it.
So similarly, the EKU Libraries were doing their own assessment at that point in time. And like a lot of university libraries across the nation, I'm sure that you're familiar with that idea of the pre and post test. So we were looking primarily just at how our students, how well they could locate, access, and evaluate information. And we also were not extending our look into that beyond our individual one-shot sessions. So they were getting that pre-post at the beginning of the 50-minute session or 75-minute session, and then the post at the end. So what we weren't looking at was what their information literacy facilities looked like beyond that session, like at the end of the semester when they were turning in that research project, and we didn't really know what use looked like once students left the library. So kind of together, we wanted to approach this issue collaboratively and holistically, and we wanted to acknowledge both verbally and through our interactions with each other, but in the way that we approached working with these classes, that information literacy development is a shared responsibility that extends beyond all of our classrooms. I should also note that around 2012 is when our writing center, which is the Knoll Studio, was first starting to offer workshops that faculty could request for their classrooms. Previously, we had just kind of done campus-wide drop-in workshops. And you'll note that kind of based on timing, you'll see that the ACRL framework had not been introduced yet when we first started looking at our interactions and our assessment. So what ACRL framework has done for us since then has provided us with the inspiration and support necessary to modify our workshop and instruction approaches, and it's reinforcing that what we thought was a good approach was a good approach.
So all of this really depended on the fact that we have a great working relationship with each other. So Trina, Jill, Leslie, Valley, and I, we all really liked working with each other. And as Trina pointed out, we realized that this was a shared responsibility and we needed to collaborate in order to address the issue. So we decided to do this trilateral case study. So looking at having classes interact in a very intentional way between librarians, the faculty teaching the writing classes, and the writing center. So those workshops that Trina just mentioned are a really important piece of that. So to really emphasize those intersections between our programs and our assessments, and also just best practices to ensure that students are successful on this front. So really our question then was, would this trilateral approach to information literacy increase efficacy and a sense of shared responsibility in support of student research, where the traditional bilateral approaches maybe fall a little bit short? So that was really where we started. So from there, we had to come up with our methodology, and we realized pretty quickly that the general education rubric that we had to use for our university mandated assessment didn't really quite fit, because it focused quite heavily on basically on surface features. So Jill really took the lead on developing a rubric to assess the information literacy piece, and you have access to that if you have a copy of our paper nearby. That's on page 138 in the appendix. You'll also see that in an upcoming slide as well. But we used a scale of just 1 to 4, 1 being beginning, 4 being accomplished. And then we did several rounds of additional assessment using that newly developed rubric that focused specifically on the information literacy piece in 2013 and 2015. And you can see our numbers there on the slide in terms of how many essays we were looking at. I also want to point out too that when we scored these, that it wasn't just like Jill and me from the first year writing side. Trina and Leslie were also involved in the scoring sessions. Trina also invited another one of our instruction librarians to participate in that. He often teaches the instruction sessions for the 102 classes. And then we also invited our graduate students. We have an English MA program, and those students typically work in the Knoll Studio as consultants. And we thought that was really an important professional development opportunity for them to see what was happening in student work on the information literacy front. So both Jill and Trina will talk more about the professional development piece a little bit later on. So as I mentioned, here are the questions that Jill developed for the rubric for our assessment. So you can see that we're looking at, just question A is pretty basic. What types of sources are the students using? You can also, let's see. Yeah, so like I said, that's also on page 138 if you have a copy of the article nearby. let's see, also looking at their formatting with citations, and then questions C and D really getting at higher order concerns. So is the integration of those sources meaningful? Does the student's use of those sources reflect an understanding of the larger conversation about the topic? So those were the ones that we were really interested in knowing what was going on those fronts in the student work. So our findings, happily, we confirmed our hypothesis that that students in sections with both kinds of supportive instruction, so library instruction and writing center instruction, were able to engage with these sources in more meaningful ways. And so just to highlight one of the areas where we saw some real growth, that in the 2013 assessment, 30% of students in the Trilateral group scored a 4 or accomplished for finding those effectively appropriate kinds of sources, whereas the group that did not participate in that, the group that was just doing that one-shot library instruction, only 10% of those students earned that distinction. So we saw that as really significant. And then here's just a visual to highlight some of those differences. Just want to point out that that on the left, you get the bilateral sections, and you see a lot of red, and so that designates a score of 2, which is developing. And then on the right, that's the data from the Trilateral sections, and you see a lot more green, which means competency. So we're really happy with those results. You can see the complete breakdown of our results, our findings, in the article itself. That starts on page 127 if you're interested in really drilling down and seeing what we were finding from both 2013 and 2015. So moving right along, so here were some of our key takeaways from this case study. We really think that the Trilateral approach provides the necessary scaffolding for student success and sets students up for ongoing growth throughout their college careers, so that they'll take this with them beyond English 102, because I think at most institutions, the first year writing sequence serves as a real gateway course for students. So we feel like that's really important. Also significant is that we now strongly suggest that first year writing instructors schedule 2 to 4 library instruction sessions instead of just 1, as well as taking advantage of the workshops the Knoll Studio offers. And then the third point there is that we really want our instructors to be intentional in their collaborations. So something just as simple as letting the librarian that they're working with know that they're also doing writing center workshops, so that there is a clear sense of collaboration, and that all of the invested parties know what's happening with that group of students. So that's, it's very purposeful in that way. Okay, and so I'm going to turn it over back to Trina.
Okay, so I noted earlier that when we started our research and assessment, the ACRL framework was really only probably in its beginning thoughts. But as we start kind of looking at our assessment, recognizing that Trilateral approach seems to prove our hypothesis and is moving our students forward more effectively in information literacy skill development, the ACRL framework kind of came out kind of at that moment, solidifying our thoughts and kind of making us more confident that this was the right approach. And it also helps us in that idea of maintaining momentum and creating a culture of buy-in, so that the thing that I think that we're kind of working on now in terms of having a common language and centering ourselves in the same place is that the ACRL framework really calls for more collaboration and an inclusive consideration of learning both within and beyond the classroom. That it highlights the importance of and emphasizes student contributions, participation, and creativity. And the Knoll Studios workshops are developed to really highlight that, and that they put the students to work on a project, a very process-oriented. It focuses on the vital role of collaboration for increasing student understanding in the processes of knowledge creation and scholarship, and encourages collaboration among disciplinary faculty, librarians, teaching and learning center staff, which in a lot of ways a writing center is kind of a learning center, and then other entities on campus. And so that's kind of serving as the framework, funnily enough, because it's ACRL framework, for us as we go forward in ensuring that our professional development and outreach methods are aligned to ensure that we continue to be successful.
Hi everyone, Jill Parrott here, and I'm going to get us started talking about what we're doing now, how we're using the data and the information that we got from the research that's outlined in our essay to what we're doing now. So we've divided this up into 3 parts, right? Our trilateral 3 parts: first year writing, the Knowles Studio, and the library. So as now the coordinator of first year writing, from my perspective, one of the biggest things that I've been able to do over the last few years is to just make sure that the library and the Knowles Studio are involved in the conversations that I'm having with instructors in a meaningful way. So really getting us in the space. By us, I mean my first year writing program. And so one thing that really works is that the Knowles Studio, a representative from the Knowles Studio, usually Trina, comes to our August meeting of the whole program. So in August, it's really the first and only day of the academic year that pretty much everyone from the first year writing program gets together. There are opportunities for work groups and workshops and professional development in smaller groups throughout the year, but the day in August is the day that everyone comes. And we make sure that the studio is there and has a little bit of time to get in front of everyone and talk about what the studio can provide, the opportunities that are there from them, and really what the enrichment that these trilateral collaborations can add to the classes, the ways it can help them and can help their students be more successful. So it's just sort of par for the course now that when I'm planning that, we don't think about whether the studio is coming, but how that's going to look, what specific focus and what specific topic that that Trina will be bringing to us on that day. And in addition, when I have everyone together like that, on those few occasions that everyone is sort of in a room together and I have a captive audience, I repeatedly encourage these multiple library interactions. And we can see on the questions here that somebody has asked how successful we are in getting people to go to the library more than once, and how are we convincing faculty to do it. Part of that is just repetition. I think I say it again and again. Part of it has been that we have had more than one person get up and share their experiences with that. For example, I always do 3 interactions. I think maybe Erin does as well. So when given the opportunity, if we're just sharing sort of this is what works for me in that kind of environment, we talk about how much better it is and what those sessions can look like, and how we can integrate that into our curriculum planning as instructors for the semester. In addition, we've encouraged them and sort of convinced them to take these extra steps to interact with the library and to go to the Knowles Studio by showing them our data. We've been really transparent with just getting up in front of everyone and looking at these numbers. And now I have to say, coming from an English department, not everyone in an English department is as persuaded by numbers as maybe Erin and I are, but we felt like it was so successful that that we've shared it with them. And I think that in many ways it can be more convincing than just, hey, why don't you try this, right? To show them that we looked at all of this student work and that we took the time to read it and to grade it and to use the rubric and to look at the data. It's been pretty convincing, and we've had good success with getting people on board with that.
Okay, so moving on to professional development in the Knowles Studio. I don't know, it may not be clear as we're talking about this, but the Knowles Studio, its part here is kind of twofold. It's both one-on-one meetings between our consultants who are in some ways writing tutors, and also that workshop setting. So I'll kind of start out by talking about how we train our consultants. So our consultants are, they're EKU students. They're typically juniors or seniors for the undergraduates, but we also employ the graduate assistants from the English department as consultants for the first year of their graduate assistantship. So our training is kind of working toward a community of practice in many ways. We start off with an initial all-staff training before the semester starts, and then we have ongoing seminars. Now, all of our training is kind of built to recognize that writing, research, communication are recursive processes. So it's very focused on kind of teaching the students a theory or a concept and then having them apply it and put it in practice. We do this through co-facilitation of training sessions with our consultants, with members of the past from first year writing, from the quality enhancement programs, critical reading focus, and also with librarians. Our reference and instruction team leader came in and co-facilitated a workshop with me for all of our consultants where we trained them how to use the question formulation technique to kind of flesh out research projects with students. And then the graduate assistants who teach in first year writing, as I mentioned, spend their first year as consultants. So all of that together is working towards this community of practice. It's not just me training the consultants. It's not just them kind of going on their own, but we are showcasing to them that this is a process and that they are one piece in a broader picture of shared responsibility for information literacy. And we're trying to be very transparent in showing them the connections between the work they do as quote unquote writing tutors and the work that the librarians are doing in the space around them. So then that consultant training program feeds into our workshop program, which is kind of one of the bigger pieces of this trilateral collaboration in terms of on the studio side of it. So again, feeding into that community of practice model, the entire workshop program is kind of co-coordinated with me by a graduate assistant consultant. And that person almost always serves as a first year writing instructor, either before and maybe during their service as the workshop coordinator here in the Knoll studio. So they are very clearly attuned to what's happening in the first year writing classroom. They are often taking their experience as a consultant into the classroom setting, and it's informing their classroom pedagogy. And then it also informs them as they move into teaching English 102 in terms of how to scaffold these experiences with the library, with their classroom approach, and with Knoll Studio workshops. In general, just like library, we're enforcing transferable skills. It's process-oriented. And we're also inviting active participation within those workshop settings with the students who are in the class, the faculty who are teaching the class, and we also are always open to the librarians who might be participating in that overall process to be a participant in that workshop as well. And again, those workshops are facilitated by Knoll Studio consultants, both graduate and undergraduate. And then, as you know, we kind of mentioned before that we started this before the framework came out, but as the framework came out, it really reinforced that we had a solid approach and that we had an approach that was reflective of that recursive process and the way we were sharing this responsibility. And so you can kind of see the workshops that we were originally offering on page, oh goodness, you have that, sorry, page 137, Appendix C. So that's kind of how we started offering things, but we have since shifted our offerings. Some of these are still available, some of them have dropped out, but we are now looking at them in terms of how they fit within that kind of ACRL framework and how they're reflective of the frames. So for example, we have a developing and refining a creative topic workshop, which really helps students break down their research topics and think about the questions they are asking, the paths of research they may need to take to start answering those questions. And it's very collaborative. The image on the left here is actually showcases some students from a first year writing classroom, an English 102 classroom, brainstorming with each other about their topics. And the individual in the blue shirt there is actually the instructor and was a graduate assistant who was consulting in the Knoll studio at that time as she was also teaching. We think that that workshop is kind of helps demonstrate the frame's research as inquiry as well as strategic exploration, because this workshop is often positioned before their first experience in the library looking for information. So brainstorming, this helps them brainstorm keywords that they take into a library instruction session to start strategically exploring to find the information. We also offer workshops that have students practice creating representations of information, practicing the ways they're going to communicate information in different ways, such as research posters or infographics, clearly reflective of information creation as a process, because they learn the process of taking information from a text-based environment and communicating it in a different way, and also how they construct their own authority within that setting. And then citation workshops, demonstrating scholarship as conversation, that you kind of construct your authority based upon the information that you're using and bringing in and how you use it. And so those workshops are often positioned kind of toward the end of a series when students have already found some information that they're going to include in their papers, and now they're thinking about how they kind of close that loop and prove that they're using that information appropriately.
Okay. One way that we're moving toward really codifying this relationship within the program is that we're currently working on a pilot for our English 102 classes that we hope will just become the standard best practice for the curriculum in those courses. And it's leaning heavily on our current QEP, the Quality Enhancement Plan, which I'm the co-director of, which is focused on critical reading, as we've mentioned before. So we're working on the work that we're doing in critical reading with librarians, first year writing, and the Knowles Studio to come up with this collaborative plan for 102 that really represents sort of a moving back and forth between these three entities on campus for the students to show the way all these different perspectives work together, or should work together, for them as they help to build their own facility with self-selected text, which is what we're calling the research that they're finding in the library that's not being presented to them as a shared reading by their instructor. So this is a really broad skeleton that I've presented here for you of what those steps are going to look like. They're much smaller, lots of moving pieces with it. But basically, we're going to start with students being introduced to an academic text in their courses, and the instructor will walk them through how to metacognitively read it as an explicit modeling of what this type of academic work looks like when you do research and you find a text that you think might be appropriate for the research that you're doing. Just how do you digest it? How do you approach it in a way that's going to help you better understand how it fits into the bigger picture? So they'll start with some modeling of that in their classroom, and then they'll move to the Knowles Studio and start thinking about their own topics and what kind of research they might want to be doing. Then they might go to the library where they start looking for finding their own sources. Then the shift will go back to the classroom where they will be directly and explicitly guided in how they can metacognitively read their own sources, right? So going back to step one, now that they have found things that might be interesting to them, how can they apply that critical reading to it? And of course, talking all the way throughout, for example, with step three, when they're in the library, considering how critical reading plays a part in that, reading the database screen, being able to digest and move through all of that information that they're finding, how to read just the basic design of a scholarly essay. What is an abstract? What do the subject terms mean? So it all is very integrated into them finding their own sources and then explicitly helping them to read it. Then in step five, we're again collaborating. We're co-developing a model project for them to do to help them understand, now that they have read these things that they found, that the library has helped them to find, and the studio has helped them focus and ask interesting questions about. And then they'll move from a sort of scaffolded collaborative project into their own synthesized research. And so that will be something pretty standard like a lit review or an annotated bibliography, or maybe we might come up with an alternative. So this is our vision, that as students are at that very integral part of their research process in the middle of the semester, where they're moving from an instructor giving them something to read to having them find their own information and need to do something smart with it, that we're going to be there with them, really explicitly holding their hand in the classroom, in the studio, and through the library to get them to a meaningful use of that information.
And so kind of to start closing us up a little bit, I hope one thing that you've noticed from what we're sharing with you is that part of ensuring that this process is successful and continues to be successful, even if parts or pieces of it leave or shift focus. So, for example, you'll notice that Leslie Valley isn't here with us because she took another position first with the university, and then she moved on to K through 12 education, actually. And so we're excited maybe to have some more students in the future. But how will we continue to ensure that this goes on without us? And so we are really focusing on developing multiple ways to interact, and also modeling multiple ways to interact. So I made note of our training, and I made note of who participates in that training. And those things are kind of established that they can happen even when I walk away. And in terms of who is conducting our workshops, you'll notice on page 141, Appendix E, if you happen to have our reading next to you, that there's actually a job description for the Knoll Studio Graduate Assistant Workshop Coordinator position that I mentioned earlier. And so even if I leave this position, that workshop collaboration is still there. Those individuals will be still trained in that way. The workshops we scheduled in the same way. In addition, again, multiple ways of interacting. That is a graduate assistant consultant who has spent a year working as a consultant and is now teaching in first year writing, and will ultimately teach in English 102, in which he or she will interact with a librarian and with the library to schedule their own workshops and their own library instruction and collaborative approaches.
Well, another way we see that the multiple ways to interact is that we're developing, it's sort of a web of individual and then bigger interactions, right? So once we're in the Knoll Studio space, for example, and I see a question about the Knoll Studio there, and yes, the Knoll Studio is located in the library space. So once students are in here, we suspect that they will, if they're in here for a workshop, as a class, then we think they'll probably come back for an individual consultation. So there are those individual things. We also, our librarians offer individual research consultation to students, so they can have one-on-one ways to interact, and then they also have the larger group ways to interact, coming into the library as a class, coming into the studio as a class, being in class with the instructor.
Yeah, and to go back to the earlier question about convincing faculty to participate, I think another smart thing that we've done is that we have a lot of our first year writing professional development in the studio, which is in the library. So we're getting our faculty into the space, and they see how dynamic it is, and they want to bring their students here. And so we think all of those things are connected, right? We're getting buy-in from our faculty, and then they're using this approach, and then that gets buy-in from the students, so they start using the resources that are available to them more and beyond first year writing. So we think that that's really, really important, that they're going to use this throughout their time at EKU and not just their freshman year.
And I think I could say too, like, in addition to being in the Knoll Studio and being a librarian, I'm the library's liaison to the English department in first year writing. So the first year writing instructors interact with me in multiple venues and at multiple levels. And so they start to get that idea that these things are connected and they should be connected. And then additionally, our librarians, because the Knoll Studio is right here in the library and that I serve on teams with them, when an instructor says to them, my student's struggling with this, who should that be? Then very often it's a librarian who comes over and says, well, there's this workshop in the studio. So even when it's coming from, an top bottom level, but it's also kind of coming from a like peer-to-peer with the individual instructors and the librarians, I think, as well. And then kind of thinking along those lines, thinking about just being able to tap into existing structures on your campus. I mentioned earlier that the studio had started. We did not always offer requestable workshops. There was a point when we were offering campus-wide drop-in workshops, and those weren't working well for us. And this quote here on the screen is actually from an article that our director and Leslie Valley, who worked on this project with us, wrote when the studio was starting to kind of move into that idea of offering requestable workshops. And we were doing that, and we were modeling that off the library's requestable instruction sessions. And so looking for these type of ideas that are already existing in writing centers or learning centers or information commons on your campuses that look for those common goals and missions, so you can kind of see overlap between the framework and the ideas that we were thinking about with our own workshops in the Writing Center, Null Studio Writing Center in 2011, right? So integrative collaboration, active participation by students and faculty, pushing, kind of blurring those lines between the classroom and the non-classroom spaces on campus. So that's kind of a local level idea, but then kind of thinking more broadly about what's happening in our individual disciplines. I'd say several of you are probably familiar with Gritano and Wittick's work on kind of looking at the overlap between the ACRL framework and the framework for success in post-secondary writing. So kind of reaching out to faculty on your campus and pointing out to them, well, here's the overlap. We are working toward a common goal, and here's how we can both meet those goals collaboratively and together. And this was actually way back in the day. Leslie and I watched this particular ACRL webinar that this slide is from, and it was part of what continued to push us to revise our workshops and revise the way we suggested instructors use them in collaboration with library instruction. So
now we're happy to take any of your questions that you have for us.
Hi, this is Sarah Miller, and I am co-moderating here. I am monitoring the questions over here in the chat box. And I'm going to go back. We have several different types of questions. We had several people ask about the number of sessions related to staffing and the librarian-student ratio. So I'm looking back here, and I think several people are wondering how you manage to up to 2 to 4 classes or 2 to 4 sessions per class with your staffing ratio.
Commitment and people really being devoted to it. It's difficult. Our staffing did not change in terms of in the library when we started pushing, when instructors started recognizing the value of having multiple interactions with the library. And we already had a really strong established relationship with that department and with some other departments on campus. So we were not necessarily in the library wanting for more instruction sessions, but we did want and value those deeper interactions. So we all just kind of agreed to take on a little more. And I think within that, kind of at the same times, and it wasn't necessarily one thing happening to support the other, but just our library is very responsive to the needs of our students and the needs of our campus. And so there were shifts in the way we were staffing our reference desk, for example, that opened us up to spending less time on the desk and more time involved in instruction interactions.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here about have you used any e-learning approaches to promote greater integration or collaboration?
We do have online sections of English 101 and 102, and those instructors are encouraged to do the same types of things with those students as much as they possibly can. I know the studio offers online consultations, so those students still have those individual peer-to-peer consultations available to them. And Trina can probably speak more to this, but I know the library is really willing to sort of bend over backwards to reach those students where they're needed. Certainly that makes it more difficult, and we haven't yet been able to codify those interactions in the way we have for the students who are on campus, because we are a mostly on-campus institution, but we're constantly working on it. And at that August PD that I was speaking about earlier, we've certainly had that question from, Trina gets up in front of everybody, says what the studio and the library can do for them, and somebody will always say, well, how can I modify that for my online class? And there's always some modification that we can make work.
Yeah, I think the library is actually doing a good job at that already. I know that we have a couple of librarians who are working with a specific instructor right now to develop a multiple interaction in the English 102, and they've been kind of piloting that this semester. Where we're struggling with is how the studio is going to also do that. So the studio is the one behind a little bit in that area.
But you do have some online resources.
We do. So that
right?
we do have online consultations, and we have some resources that can guide a student kind of through what we would guide them through in a workshop setting. But we haven't quite got there with how do we replicate that workshop setting in an online environment right now.
Great. There are a couple questions here about scaffolding. First of all, a clarification, is English 102 a sequence after English 101?
Yes.
Okay.
It is. 101 is, the title is Reading, Writing, and Rhetoric, and we focus exclusively in that course on the critical reading of sort of primary text, a shared text that students are all looking at, mostly essays. And then 102 is Research, Writing, and Rhetoric, and that's when we transition them from looking at sort of one or two texts that they have some time to sort of talk about in their classrooms to these self-selected texts in research projects. So we build that up for them.
Okay, great. There's another question. Please describe best practices and/or innovations in communicating collaboration and unity of effort in situations where there is resistance to collaboration. For example, worries about job overlap, blurring lines of authority or accountability, failure to see peers as experts, etc.
It's a difficult one.
It is
That's a great question. Yeah, it really is. I think we mentioned this, that we were really lucky in that we're friends. Like, we like working with each other. We work together well. So we were lucky in that regard, but we were actually talking about this a little bit though. So just a little bit more history. So Jill and I used to co-coordinate the first year writing program, and then now she's the coordinator of the program, and I do assessment work on campus. But in the beginning, we did get some resistance from people who were teaching first year writing about these kinds of collaborations and the approaches that we were suggesting. And we've seen a shift in that culture, I think, because of our collaborations and these ongoing efforts and the work, especially that we're doing with the graduate consultants. And I think I saw a question on there somewhere too about TAs, because I think that they have been really great in being those people during the PDs who stand up and say, hey, I'm doing this, I'm using this approach, and I'm seeing great results with my students. My students are producing better work. They understand how to find sources and evaluate them and integrate them into their own text. And I think that sort of our sustained efforts on that front, we have seen a real shift in the culture. Because would you not agree that when we first took over, like, there was some real resistance. And so, and of course I saw some questions too, I think, about adjuncts and that sort of thing. So I think it's just the sustained professional development. Yeah. Has been really important for us, getting this kind of buy-in so that people are open to collaborating, and also just seeing that it kind of makes everyone's life a little bit easier too, right? If you don't have to be, if this instructor, especially an adjunct who may be teaching at multiple institutions and have 5 or 6 sections of first year writing, if you can show them that, like, look, you don't have to be the expert in all of these areas. You have these great human resources who are actually experts in these areas who can help out with that and help your students. And I think that's been powerful for us too in getting buy-in.
Yeah, it's definitely been a step-by-step sort of thing. We didn't just tell everybody that we wanted to have these types of relationships, and everyone went, "That sounds great." You know, it's been years and years of effort, and part of it has been working with graduate consultants. Part of it has been instructor turnover, you know, at some adjuncts coming in, some adjuncts leaving, and I think just being transparent with what works. And at first I think there were fewer people doing this than the majority were not doing this. And over the years, now it has, you know, we picked up person by person by person, and it's more the minority now. There are only a few people who don't have these types of interactions, I would say. So the demographics have shifted to who's sort of on the train with us for this.
Do you have any advice for folks who are starting from scratch, trying to build collaborations across departments at the universities?
I think to me it would be going and not to say like, oh, use our chapter to, you know, showcase things, but there are probably other chapters and other more research out there that demonstrates that when we work together, we see better results. And so I would be transparent, and I would bring the data, and I would bring the numbers, and then also do things like looking at the overlapping goals at the professional organizational level. When our framework is telling us the same thing that the writing program administration and writing teachers for post-secondary education, when all our frameworks are saying the same thing, then that's evidence that this is a shared responsibility and that we can benefit from having transparent and intentional conversations about it. So I would take those things in. I can say from recent experience that I even learned that occupational therapy has a guiding framework that has components that overlap with the ACRL framework even. So it goes beyond just writing programs.
And I would add maybe from the WPA perspective, writing program administrator perspective, that I believe most WPAs want what's best for their program and what's best for students. I just tend to believe that most people want to be good at their jobs. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think most people want to be good at their jobs. And if you know who that person is and feel comfortable asking them, almost all writing programs have at least one day a year where everybody gets together for a few hours or a whole day or maybe a couple of days to talk about the program, get everybody on board, look at a new textbook, grade some sample student writing, you know, whatever it is that they're doing. And if a librarian can get in there for just 10 or 15 minutes to talk about what the library can do for them and what options are, and if you present it as this is going to help you, I'm here to help you, let's work together, instead of something that they have to do, I think that makes a world of difference. Just like as an instructor, it makes a difference for me. If I see somebody face to face and they seem like a nice person who wants to help me, I'm going to reach back out to them.
Yeah, and just to sort of piggyback onto that, I think like that's something that Trina does exceptionally well, is that everyone in our department, everyone in the English department knows Trina and knows that Trina is a great person to work with. So I think, you know, if you're that person, people want to work with you, right? So.
Great. Another question, what kind of increase did you see with students coming in for individual consultations at your Knowles Studio Writing Center, distinct from consultations with your librarians?
So did we see an increase in consultations in the Writing Center because of this collaboration? Is that distinct from consultations with your librarians?
Yeah, it's in the comments there. Yep.
Do you have that data?
I don't think I have. I don't think I could confidently answer that question without data in front of me. And I think we're in an interesting position because the Writing Center on campus used to be outside of the library, and then it it moved inside the library and also really changed its mission and vision in terms of how we served. And so we definitely saw an increase in writing center consultations when we moved into the library. I'm not knowing, kind of anecdotally being in the space, I do believe we saw more consultations with both in the Knoll studio and with the librarians based upon more interactions, more workshops, more library instructions, because I know I have done workshops and library instructions with students where they have said to me, oh, like, this is what you do in a consultation. I can get this kind of work help in the library, because they have very narrow views of what a writing center consultation or tutoring session is, or what a research reference appointment is. And I think when they see us in multiple venues and in multiple ways doing diverse things and working with each other, it extends their thoughts on what we can help them with. And so anecdotally, I think it went up, but I could not confidently say that. I couldn't prove it with numbers, but I believe it.
Right. And we certainly think that this sort of relationship can lessen the stigma of those kinds of interactions. I mean, unfortunately, there is still a bit of a stigma, for example, going to a consultation at a writing center, because students, you know, they have this thought that it should be right the first time, right? That if they're a good writer, it will just be right the first time. And that if you have to go get help, that's somehow remedial in some way. And so I think having all these built-in interactions that expose them to the way that the libraries can help, and that it just becomes expected as part of this, is a big part of that success for us.
Yeah. And I'm also seeing a question about the setup of 101 and 102 already there before the initiative.
We did revise it, and I think it was in part because of this work that we were doing. Because before this, when we inherited the program, the course titles, it was something like English 101 was just Composition 1, and English 102 was Composition 2, so, which was real specific, right? So we, as part of this, had conversations about, okay, really, what are the student learning outcomes for those classes? And so we really refined it. So as Jill pointed out, 101 is reading, writing, and rhetoric, and 102 is research, writing, and rhetoric. So that so obviously it's connected, but it's building, right? So that there's that kind of scaffolding going on within the sequence where they're engaging with primary sources that we're giving them in 101, and then making that transition to finding their own sources and reading those critically and working with them in interesting ways in 102. And then connected to that, I see another question about the assessment process. And since that's what I'm interested in right now, I think that is going to shift, right? I mean, Jill's vision, and we had talked about this a long time ago, is that we want to shift from that traditional 8-page research paper to doing an e-portfolio.
And there's no way that my program would be able to do that unless we work with the studio and with the library. It has to be all of us getting on board with the e-portfolio, or it's not going to work. So we're pushing forward with that, and have to keep this going in order for that to be a success, and in order through assessment to show our university that we're doing our jobs in the program. We have to have the help of the library and the studio.
And I'm seeing questions about requirements. Writing instructors require students to have a research consultation with librarians, and if so, do they get a grade for it? It's kind of up to the individual writing instructor. I don't think many of them are requiring a research consultation with a librarian. Some of them require at least one writing center consultation and or offer extra credit for it. And that's the same with the research consultation. Sometimes they'll offer extra credit, but I think they're operating much more on an individual level with the students. When they see a student who has hit a wall or is struggling, they kind of encourage and or require that individual student to seek out the help that would help them. I'll also throw into that, because of the way that we train our consultants in the studio, and because of being physically located in the library and me being a member of the library, our consultants in the studio are very good and very attuned at where their kind of expertise in terms of the research process ends and the librarians begin. And they are very often, I see them walk a student out to the reference desk or pull up the research consultation appointment form with the librarian, because we have a form to facilitate that online, or even walk a student over to the librarian offices that are pretty close to the studio. So I think it has increased things like that. The student who doesn't know where they should be, it doesn't really matter, because we will get them where they should be regardless of where they show up.
Okay, it looks like we've gotten through most of the questions. Does anyone in the webinar have another question to post on chat? We have a few more minutes. Okay, thank you so much. Joanna, do you want to close us out?
Sure thing. So there was a question in the chat about whether the session was being recorded. It is being recorded, and we will send out that link in the next few days along with a feedback form for today's presentation. So definitely look for that in your inbox.
And certainly, if I can just say, I know any of us, you have our contact information, so we'd be happy to talk more about it if you have questions, or if you're working on something at your school that you'd like to chat about, or if you'd like to see some materials, just please let us know.
Thank you all so much for your excellent presentation. I really appreciate your willingness to talk to us today. And thank you so much for everyone attending and all of the wonderful organizers who helped us set this up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think that's it. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.